On August 28, 1944, Lieutenant David Deadeye Miller of the 352nd Fighter Group was bored. He was at 28,000 feet over Germany, the Merlin engine of his P-51 Mustang, the Ohio Queen, purring like a well-fed lion. Below him, a vast glittering constellation of B-17 flying fortresses crawled across the deep blue sky, their contrails like chalk-white banners. This was an escort mission, a milk run. The sky was clear, the flak was light, and the Luftwaffe, it seemed, had decided to stay home. Miller sipped the stale, metallic-tasting oxygen from his mask and scanned the horizon for the 100th time, his eyes aching from the glare. The cold was a living thing at this altitude, seeping through his fleece-lined boots and stinging his skin. He wiggled his toes just to feel them. This was the reality of high-altitude escort. Hours of crushing monotony, punctuated by moments of sheer, heart-stopping terror. Today, it was all monotony. And then, he saw it. It wasn't a plane. It couldn't be. It was a contrail, but it was moving with a speed that defied all logic, coming straight at the bombers from their 6 o'clock high. It was a white pencil line, drawn across the sky by an invisible, impossibly fast hand. There was no glint of a propeller, no familiar silhouette of a Focke-Wulf or a Messerschmitt. Just a shape, more like a shark than a bird, impossibly sleek. "Blue Flight, this is leader. Bandit, 6 o'clock high," Miller yelled into his radio, his voice cracking, the boredom instantly vaporized by a flood of adrenaline. My God, he's fast. I've never seen anything." He didn't have time to finish. The object didn't fly past the bomber formation. It flew through it. It was a silver flash, a whisper. Miller saw a string of bright orange lights, like angry hornets, spit from the creature's nose. A B-17 on the formation's edge, the lucky lady, simply came apart. Its right wing sheared off, and the massive bomber cartwheeled into a terminal, silent spin. Its 10-man crew scattered to the frozen winds. And the attacker? It was gone. It didn't dive away. It fled. Climbing, of all things, climbing away from them, pulling up into the sun with a velocity that seemed to mock the laws of physics. Miller and his wingman dove their Mustangs, firewalling the throttles, the Merlins screaming in protest. It was like a race car trying to catch a bullet. The silver ghost just shrank into a dot and vanished. The entire encounter, from first sighting to the B-17's demise, had taken less than 10 seconds. Silence filled the radio, broken only by Miller's heavy, ragged breathing into his oxygen mask. He had just witnessed the future, and it was terrifying. It was a ghost, a demon. It was the Messerschmitt Me-262. That evening, at his base in Bodney, England, Lieutenant Miller found himself in a smoky debriefing room, facing a stone-faced intelligence officer named Colonel Hayes. Miller's hands, he noted with some embarrassment, were still shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. "Let's go over it again, Lieutenant," Hayes said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He'd heard 3 other nearly identical reports that week. "You said it had no propellers." Miller nodded, the acrid smoke stinging his lungs. "That's right, sir. None. It just made this sound. Not a roar, a scream. A high-pitched tearing sound, like the sky was ripping apart. And the speed, Colonel, you just can't understand. We were doing 400 in a dive, and he pulled away from us like we were standing still. He was climbing. He climbed away from us, sir. After killing the fort, he climbed. Who the hell can do that?" Hayes leaned back in his chair, tapping a pencil on a file thick with similar frantic reports. "You're not the first, Miller. We've been getting these stories for 2 months. Pilots babbling about comets and silver darts. Half of them we thought were seeing things, suffering from hypoxia. But the gun cameras, The gun cameras don't lie, and now they're showing up in force. He opened the file. Its top secret stamp's dark red. The Germans call it the Schwalbe, the Swallow, a jet-propelled fighter, powered by two Junkers Jumo 004 engines. Our best estimate puts its top speed at over 530 miles per hour, maybe 550. Miller did the math in his head and felt sick. His brand-new P-51D, the absolute pinnacle of piston engine technology, could maybe touch 440 in a full-power dive. This thing was 100 miles per hour faster, in level flight. "Sir, how do we fight that?" Miller asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You're telling me he's 100 miles per hour faster, and he outclimbs us. What do we do? Just watch?" Colonel Hayes closed the file, the sound like a gavel. "That, Lieutenant," he said, standing up, "is the question we are going to answer." "You're right. You can't outrun it. You can't outclimb it. You can't fight it the way you fight a 109. If you try, you will die. So we change the rules. We find another way. We can't outrun it, so we have to outthink it." Thousands of miles away, at a Luftwaffe test facility near the Lech River, Oberleutnant Franz Weiser was climbing into the cockpit of that same monster. Weiser was an experte, an ace with 72 victories against Russian and American fighters. He was a man who had mastered the snarling, prop-driven Focke-Wulf 190, a plane he flew with his fingertips. But this Me-262 was something else. It was not an airplane. It was a projectile. He felt the familiar click as the ground crew sealed his canopy, but that's where the familiarity ended. He went through the startup procedure, a delicate, nerve-wracking process. You didn't just start the Jumo 004 jet engines. You nursed them. You cajoled them. You prayed to them. He engaged the starter, and with a cough of black smoke, the turbine began to whine. The whine grew into a scream, a sound of pure, barely contained power. He released the brakes, and the 262 accelerated with a smoothness that felt like angel's breath pushing him from behind. There was no violent torque, no rattling vibration from 1,000 moving pistons, just this unearthly liquid thrust. He was airborne in seconds, climbing at a rate that pinned him to his seat, a rate that felt like a violation of nature. He leveled off at 30,000 feet, far above the reach of any Allied fighter, and looked down on the world. He felt like a god. His first combat encounter had been just like Miller's, but from the other side. He'd seen a formation of B-17s, escorted by P-51s. He pushed his throttle forward, gently, and the 262 had lunged. The P-51s, 10,000 feet below, turned towards him, but it was a comical slow-motion gesture. They looked like toys anchored to the earth. He was on them and through their formation before they could even level their wings. He targeted a Mustang, a flash of red on its tail, and pressed the triggers. The 262's 430mm cannons erupted, a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of metal. The heavy, low-velocity shells, designed to kill bombers, struck the P-51. The Mustang didn't just trail smoke. It didn't break apart. It vaporized. It simply ceased to exist in a puff of red and black. Weiser was past them, out of range, and climbing before the debris had even begun to fall. It was, he thought to himself, completely and totally unbeatable. This machine, he was sure, would sweep the skies clean. This machine would win the war. But Franz Weiser, for all his arrogance, was about to discover what Colonel Hayes's intelligence officers were already piecing together. The Me-262 was a technological marvel, but it was a flawed marvel. It was a weapon of desperation, rushed into production far too early. A diamond full of cracks. Its strengths were blinding, but its weaknesses were fatal. The first and most critical flaw was the very thing that gave it life. The Jumo 004 engines. They were revolutionary, but they were built by a war machine that was collapsing. The alloys needed for high-temperature turbine blades, rich in nickel and cobalt, were gone. The Germans were forced to make them from less durable steel alloys, built by exhausted, terrified slave laborers. The average service life of a Jumo 004 engine, as the Allies would later learn, was not 1,000 hours. It was not 100. It was between 10 and 25. Every time Weiser flew, he was sitting on 2 time bombs. And they had a horrifying quirk, the throttle. In his P-51, Miller could slam his throttle from idle to full power in a second. If Weiser did that in the 262, the sudden change in fuel flow would either starve the engine, causing the flame out, or more likely, flood the turbine with fuel, causing it to overheat, melt its own blades, and explode. Weiser's instructor, a grizzled, cynical Hauptmann named Schultz, had slapped his hand away from the throttle in training. "Idiot," Schultz had screamed over the intercom. "Are you trying to kill us? You don't fly this engine. You negotiate with it. You nurse it. You ask it politely. You jam that throttle and I promise you, it will send you to hell." Weiser had learned that fear. He learned to nurse the throttle, gently, delicately, as if coaxing a nervous horse. In the chaos of a dogfight, this was a death sentence. There was no go-around power. There was no instant acceleration to escape trouble. The second flaw was the plane itself. It was a javelin, not a rapier. Its sheer speed and swept wings gave it a turning radius that was, by fighter standards, abysmal. It couldn't turn and burn. Hauptmann Schultz had demonstrated this by taking Weiser up and, in a slow 300-mile-per-hour mock fight, had easily gotten on Weiser's tail in an old Bf 10-9. "See?" Schultz's voice crackled. "You are a brick. You are a meteor. You go straight. You do not turn. If a Mustang gets on your tail and you try to turn with him, you die. Your speed is your only armor. You use it to attack and you use it to escape, period. If a 262 pilot made the mistake of slowing down and trying to dogfight, he was a dead man." The third and most significant flaw, the one Colonel Hayes and his team seized upon, was logistical. The Me-262 was a sitting duck on the ground. It required long, concrete runways, unlike the prop fighters that could operate from a muddy field. This meant the Allies knew exactly where the 262s lived, and its delicate, unresponsive engines made takeoff and, most especially, landing the most dangerous moments of any flight. During its long takeoff roll, it was slow, clumsy, and struggling to build speed. And on its landing approach, it was a pilot's worst nightmare. Flaps down, gear down, flying at a painfully slow 120 miles per hour, with engines at near idle. Engines that could not be throttled up quickly to escape an attack. This was not a flaw. This was a "kick me" sign. In debriefing rooms across England, the new doctrine was being written. Colonel Hayes stood before his pilots, including a newly focused Lieutenant Miller. "Gentlemen," he said, pointing to a diagram of the 262, "we have our answer. You will not fight this plane. You will not try to outrun it. You will not engage it in a high-speed chase. You will, instead, hunt it. You cannot win a symmetrical fight, so we will change the rules. We will attack the system, not the plane. The new strategy was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare, and it had three main pillars. The first was the diving pounce. P-51 groups escorting bombers were no longer to fly with the bombers. They were to be shepherds on the mountaintop. They would fly 10,000 feet above the bomber stream, a high-speed, high-energy cap, waiting. Lieutenant Miller, now a flight commander, was one of those shepherds. On a cold, gray day in November 1944, he saw them again. Two Tu-62s climbing from below, ignoring the P-51s, and heading straight for the B-17. This time Miller didn't panic. He didn't chase. He watched. He waited. He saw the lead German pilot, perhaps our old friend Franz Weiser, level off and begin his attack run. He saw the 262 slow down. In order to aim those devastating 30mm cannons, which had a slower muzzle velocity, the 262 had to slow from its blistering 530 miles per hour to a more manageable 400. It had to create a firing solution. And in that moment, that tiny 2-second window where the jet had to become a stable gun platform, it was vulnerable. "Blue flight, tally-ho!" Miller yelled. "I'm taking the leader." He rolled his P-51 over, pointed its nose straight down, and let gravity do the work. His Mustang shrieked, the airframe buffeting as the airspeed indicator needle redlined. He was diving with all the energy of altitude on his side. Weiser, his eyes fixed on the B-17 in his gun sight, never saw him coming. Miller's P-51 in its power dive closed the gap. He was going over 500 miles per hour. He was catching the jet. He was in range. He opened fire, his 6.50 caliber machine guns tearing into the 262's right engine. Weiser felt the impact like a hammer blow. His instrument panel exploded. The Jumo 004, hit by a stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, did exactly what flawed, overworked engines do. It disintegrated. A sheet of fire erupted from the wing. Weiser, his arrogance gone, his cockpit filling with smoke, fought the controls. But the plane was already rolling over, out of control. He had no choice but to jettison his canopy and bail out, a tiny, tumbling figure against the vast, cold sky. Miller watched him fall, his heart hammering. He hadn't outrun the jet, he had outweighted it. He had used its one moment of vulnerability as a weapon. The second tactic was the turning fight, a strategy that relied on a German pilot making a fatal mistake. Lieutenant Skeeter Harris, a pilot with the 4th Fighter Group, was one who got the chance. On December 5th, he was bounced by a 262, the German pilot, a rookie, overshooting him in a high-speed pass. Harris, instead of trying to run, did the opposite. He yanked his stick back, dropped 15 degrees of flaps, and kicked his rudder, bleeding off his speed in a violent skid. The German pilot, arrogant and eager for his first jet kill, made the mistake Harris was praying for. He tried to turn. He pulled his 262 into a hard bank to finish the Mustang off. It was a fatal error. Hauptmann Schultz's warning was ringing true. The 262's turning circle was massive. Harris, his Mustang now at a relatively slow 250 miles per hour, simply pulled his nose inside the 262's gentle sweeping turn. The jet was stuck. like a car on a highway trying to follow a bicycle that just turned down a narrow alley. The jet pilot, in a panic, realized what was happening, but it was too late. He couldn't tighten his turn. Harris was on his 6 o'clock, his gun sight pipper resting perfectly on the 262's fuselage. He didn't miss. The 262, its unbeatable speed rendered useless, was torn to pieces by a plane 100 miles per hour slower. But the third and most effective tactic, the strategy that truly broke the back of the 262 threat, was the most ruthless. It was the Airfield Ambush. Allied command identified the key Me-262 airbases, fields like Achmer, Lechfeld, and Kaltenkirchen, and they began to hunt the jets where they lived. On October 7, 1944, a full month before Miller's victory, Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew of the 361st Fighter Group was on a patrol near Achmer. He knew it was a jet base. High above, he and his wingman circled, loitering on station, waiting like vultures. The patience required was immense. It was boring. It was cold. But Drew was a hunter. And then he saw them. Not in the sky, but on the ground. 2 Me-262s glistening in the afternoon sun were taxiing onto the runway to take off. They were at their most vulnerable. Drew rolled his P-51, the Detroit Miss, into a steep dive. He was coming out of the sun, a perfect textbook attack. The German pilots, their canopies open as they prepared for their takeoff roll, had no idea. Drew screamed down, his Mustang's engine at full wartime power. He lined up on the first 262. It was just beginning to roll. He opened fire, his 6.50 caliber pistols hammering the jet. He saw his tracers walk straight into the cockpit and engine. The 262 erupted in a massive orange and black fireball. But Drew wasn't done. He pulled up, saw the second 262 just lifting off the runway, its wheels retracting, agonizingly slow. The German pilot had seen his comrade explode and was trying to escape. Drew rolled in behind him, a perfect deflection shot. He fired again. The 262, barely 100 feet in the air, shuddered. Its port engine exploded. It cartwheeled into the field at the end of the runway, disintegrating in a second fiery crash. In less than 60 seconds, Lieutenant Urban Drew had shot down 2 unbeatable jet fighters. He hadn't engaged them at 500 miles per hour. He'd engaged them at 100. He hadn't fought the plane. He had fought the system. This was the end of the 262's mystique. The Airfield Ambush, or rat-catching, as the pilots called it, became the standard order of business. P-51s and British Tempests would orbit the jet bases for hours, waiting for the 262s to return home. The German pilots, after surviving a harrowing mission over the bombers, would face their most terrifying trial, the last 2 minutes of their flight. And what of Franz Weiser? He had survived his bailout, landing in a frozen field, his pride as broken as his ankle. When he returned to his squadron at Lechfeld, he was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow fear. He was no longer a god, he was prey. His new terror wasn't the P-51s at 30,000 feet, it was the P-51s at 3,000 feet, circling his home. The Luftwaffe tried to counter. They set up massive flak alleys, rings of hundreds of anti-aircraft guns around their own airfields, pointed not at high-altitude bombers, but at the low-flying rat-catchers. The German pilots now had to fly through a gauntlet of their own fire just to land. On his last flight of the war, in April 1945, Weiser was on his final approach. He'd nursed his engines, he'd evaded the high escorts, and he was descending toward the runway. He saw it, the glint of a P-51 diving out of the clouds. He jammed his throttle forward, a desperate, forbidden act, and his left engine, just as Hauptmann Schultz had warned, exploded. The 262 yawed violently, and Weiser, fighting for his life, managed to crash land the plane, sliding to a fiery halt. He survived, but as he crawled from the wreckage, he knew the war was over. The hunters had become the hunted. The P-51, the little friend, had proven that ingenuity, strategy, and adaptability were more powerful than a technological leap. The Me-262 was a weapon of the future, a what-if that signaled the end of the propeller age, but it was a flawed weapon, flown in a failing system. The Allied pilots, men like David Miller, Skeeter Harris, and Urban Drew, couldn't match its speed, so they matched it with brains. They refused to fight the jet on its own terms. They changed the rules of engagement. They turned its greatest strengths into weaknesses and exploited its fatal flaws with ruthless, clinical precision. The unbeatable ghost that had terrified the skies in the summer of 1944 was, by the spring of 1945, a hunted, endangered species, a symbol not of German superiority, but of a brilliant, desperate, and ultimately failed gamble.